So hello everybody, welcome back. This is a particular treat and pleasure for me today as a scholar of digital economy. We're very lucky to have Professor Yu Hong visiting us from Zhejiang University in China. She is a professor of media and international culture at Zhejiang University, but she did her PhD in the communications from the University of Illinois. She's an expert on China's global digital footprint, and she's undertaken research on China's foreign aid in ICT, particularly in Africa, examining the motivations of foreign direct investment and networking, and studying what the impact is for regional economic development and South-South relations. She's recently co-edited a book, China's Globalizing Internet, History, Power, and Governance, and she's currently working on a new book manuscript in Chinese called States and the Cybersphere, History, Governance, and Development. She's joining us here at the LSE as a Mayling Birney scholar. Some of you might not know who Mayling was. She was a very dear colleague of ours in the International Development Department who was working on the comparative politics of China, and particularly looking at the dynamic relationship between the central state in China and local politicians and policymakers. And when I was reading the paper for tonight, I saw a lot of synergies with her work, so it's nice to kind of remember Mayling today. So tonight, Yu Hong is going to be talking about the kind of dynamic and hybrid nature of China's media landscape, showing how it's marked both by kind of state developmental strategies and political objectives to extend infrastructural power, but also by kind of private competition and entrepreneurship. She's going to demonstrate the kind of multiple functions of the digital infrastructure, not only its kind of economic infrastructure, but also it as a political infrastructure as well as a kind of cultural infrastructure, and showing the ways in which private firms and governments blend these kinds of functions. I think her research really underscores the sense that we have to do quite careful, empirically grounded work on digital technologies. In place of this kind of very technologically deterministic view, which kind of sees the outcomes of digitization coming from the technologies themselves, she shows how much digitization kind of plays out differently in different contexts, depending on political power, but also market power as well. In this way, we can have no better discussant than Professor David Soskice. He's probably best known for his co-edited book, Varieties of Capitalism, which I know some of you read last term, and has been a source of inspiration for many scholars. He's an emeritus professor in the government department, as well as the former director of the International Inequalities Institute at the LSE. He's published too many books and papers to name all of them, but his two recent books are one with Tove Iversen, Democracy and Prosperity, Reinventing Capitalism Through a Turbulent Century, as well as a book that I think is coming out this year with Wendy Carlin called Macroeconomics, Institutions, Instability, and Inequality. So without further ado, I'd like us to welcome Professor Yu Hong to the podium, as well as to the LSE and to our department.
Thank you. So first of all, I would like to thank James, Laura, and Tim for bringing me here. It's really a great pleasure and also an honor to be a visiting scholar at LSE. And it's also such a pressure thing to spend 3 weeks on this very beautiful campus and to do some deep thinking and intellectual interaction. So, so what I'm going to talk about is something that that I draw from my working manuscript. And I want to thank James for suggesting this very vivid title, Bringing Cyberspace Down to Earth. So what I'm going to do in this talk, I think we'll have 4 parts. First of all, I'm going to explain, is this microphone work?
I think so.
Okay. So first of all, I'm going to explain the key concept. I want to explain what do I mean by cyberspace, and why I come up with alternative term, cybersphere. And then I want to explain my theoretical positioning. In the third part of my talk, I will kind of cut to the chase. I will summarize my research outcome. And then ultimately, hopefully, I can bring out some larger conceptual implications of this research. So let me first start with this old but still relevant story. As you probably know, over the past 40 plus years, China reintegrated with the US-led neoliberal global order. China participated in the global division of labor, and therefore China has become part of this global economy. And by doing so, by carrying out market reform and opening up, China has achieved considerable success, both in terms of domestic reforms, in terms of pushing forward new institutional reforms, and also externally, China has become an important member of the global community, right? And maintaining a high level of interdependence with other parts of the world. So as of now, I think China's position is a position of paradox. On the one hand, China is entangled with this US-led global economic system, but on the other hand, I think China is moving away and moving against these status quo. So I think as we all understand, this is a time of great uncertainty, a great turbulence. During a time like this, it's very important to recognize the agency of states and the societies. So this is kind of an old and relevant story that set up the backdrop of my ongoing research. So now let me explain why I'm so interested in the internet, why I'm so interested in the cyberspace and cybersphere, as I call it. So the reason I'm interested in the internet is because increasingly we notice that China's interaction with the world or China's modernization is carried out through the internet. Okay, China interacts with the world through the internet. I think most of the audiences will agree with me on that. And also China's modernization has a very strong dose of digitization. Okay, so because of that, the internet actually has become a very important variable in understanding the Chinese version of modernity. So therefore, we need to clarify, what do we mean by the internet? Okay, we understand that the internet is global in scope. Okay, but it's very important to emphasize that the internet is not a virtual space. The internet is not a virtual space outside of physical space. It's not a virtual space out of the reach of social forces. Okay, so I think it's very important to see internet as embedded in social relations and social forces. And because of that, the internet from the beginning of its establishment is defined by different competing practices and norms. Okay, so therefore, in order to kind of counter the often see digital sublime, digital utopianism, my co-author and I come up with a new term called cybersphere, because we feel that oftentimes cyberspace is associated with a kind of digital sublime. But at the same time, we want to highlight three features of the internet. The first one is materiality, meaning that no matter how virtual we experience the cyberspace, actually the internet always have material groundings. If you think about the power bases, if you think about all the material devices, you think about the 5G, the internet actually is never outside of physical space. Okay, so the materiality is a key feature of the internet. And the second feature, I think, is relationality, meaning that the internet, as I mentioned, is defined by social relations. In my view, the internet expands because people take out communicative actions with each other. And as the communicative relations accumulate, internet will expand. Okay, still people communicate and interact from certain social positions and for certain social purposes. So therefore, power always matters. Power often influence social relations, and the power always have the advantage in producing connections, in organizing relations, in expressing certain ideas. So therefore, cyberspace, cybersphere, or the internet, it is defined by relational dimensions. Okay, so in my view, what I understood as the internet is not only a material thing, but also a communication kind of outcome. Okay, and the third feature of the internet, as we conceptualize it, is in terms of disagreement. Okay, so the internet is not a given thing. Okay, it's nothing given. Actually, it is from the outset of internet development. The internet as an infrastructure, as an artifact, is always defined by disagreement. People disagree on how internet should be developed, for what purpose, by whom, for whose interest, and how we should govern the internet. So the internet is always defined by disagreement. So by these three dimensions, I think we get to getting to a much more fundamental level of how to understand cyber politics. Okay, so because we have these conceptualizations, so we become unhappy with the photo I'm showing you. Okay, because this photo looks very futuristic. It looks really immaterial. Okay, so I find another photo I think better represent my view about what cyberspace or cybersphere is. So as you can see, the cybersphere actually today really has come to encompass all aspects of social life, from economic transaction to information exchange to diplomatic relations. And I would even go further to claim that the cybersphere has become the social life itself, where a wide range of social technical systems interconnect peoples, interconnect things, and channel flows. Okay, so I would even think that today we can call the social life as a mediated social life, and the material foundation is the internet. So, so I think now I have explained my key concept. And one more point I want to make is about the spatiality of the so-called cybersphere. When we think about cybersphere, we often use the terms such as interconnectivities, because we use the internet to connect with each other. But how about vertical relations? How about hierarchical relations? Does hierarchical relation continue to exist within cyberspace? I think it's important to recognize that vertical relations continue to characterize the spatiality of the cybersphere. So I use this photo as a metaphorical imagery to illustrate what the cybersphere really looks like. I think this is a photo of islands, right? They are archipelagos. So they are little islands rise above the sea. So you can compare these islands to digital platforms. Okay. So in our cyberspace, we access the cyberspace through all kinds of platforms, and these platforms are just like the island that rise above the sea. But what is less visible is the roots of these platforms, meaning that for this platform economy to really operate, the platform needs to thrust its roots into local communities and local populations in order to extract value. Okay, because we know the platform doesn't produce anything. Think about Facebook, think about Twitter. They don't produce anything. What they do is that they will connect populations, connect things, and they will extract values from local community, local population, so that the information, sentiment, and commodities can start to flow in a variety of directions. Okay, so I think it's very important to understand that the cybersphere, on the one hand, interconnect people, and there are hubs and there are some nodes are more important. There are hubs, and within the hubs, there are different ties, right? So there is a skewedness in terms of the distribution of degrees according to the network theory. But still, the network, the web term is quite horizontal imagery. It's very important on top of that to understand that apart from interconnectivities, we also need to understand that the cybersphere actually has become vertical. It has become hierarchical in the sense that digital assemblages cannot exist without exporting kind of local communities and local resources. So, so with these definition and with the explanation of the spatiality, I think now I can I kind of try to provide a metaphorical plane on which we can see China's position. So I study China from three perspectives. One is China in the world. So basically, I think today's global order is a global order defined by interconnectivities and communications. So China has merged itself into the flows, so to speak. But it's a hierarchical flow. It's not a horizontal flow. It's a hierarchical flow. And so yeah, China has become part of these global flows. And the global flows is not, it has directions. It has certain structures, okay? So that's China in the world, how we see China, how we understand China. It's not an isolated country. It is, what is happening inside of China oftentimes needs to define through these transnational perspectives, okay? So in other words, China's position is located within these webs of relations. And the second dimension of my research really talk about China and the world. Basically talking about China, how China negotiating its position in the world, okay? And the key actor here actually are transnational corporations and transnational platforms, because these kind of institutions today actually organize resources and organize how resources are distributed and how they flow, in what direction. Okay, so China, on the one hand, accommodate transnational corporations and transnational platforms, and on the other hand, Chinese state in particular is trying to build its own steering mechanisms. And the last aspect of my interest is about China's world. In other words, China is globalizing itself. So China is exporting artifacts, exporting institutions and visions. So in order to understand the ramifications of this globalizing China, I think it's very important to keep up with what is going on in the digital domain. Okay, so that's kind of my key concepts. And now I can get to my second part, which is about the theoretical positioning. When we study, for those who know my work, I have a continuing interest in China's developmental stance towards and within the internet. And on this concept, I think there are some very obvious conventional wisdoms. And some people see China as a contender for hegemonic power. Okay, so basically as another contender for hegemonic power by exercising techno-economic nationalism. Okay, so there is a realist narrative circulating and this realist narrative basically frame China as another contender for power. I think it's these kind of storyline can often be found in news cover pages, in commentaries. So that's one type of narrative. Another type of narrative is to see China as an authoritarian regime disrupting the free flow of information in the so-called borderless internet. And so I think there are two versions of dominant frameworks to talk about China. And there's a third one, which is on the intellectual left. I think increasingly on the intellectual left, people started to see China as a capitalist nation. Okay, I think there is a growing concern that China really has become a capitalist society in the post-Mao era. So altogether, I think combining what is going on the intellectual right and what is going on the intellectual left, I think overall the image, the imagination of China is not quite positive. China is poised as either is depicted as either wants to dominate or fracture the global order. So for me, my position is that these perspectives are all valuable. They all have values, but they are alternative explanations for me to explain what's going on right now, because they are insufficient for explaining what I observe right now as China keeps transforming itself. So let me share with you some of my observations in recent years. So first of all, I think from a communication perspective, China is not a giant cage. Instead of being an authoritarian cage, as these Economist page show, China actually has a pretty hybrid system of communication. Okay, and it follows neither the logic of staticism nor liberalism. Different political economies coexist, collaborate, and collide with each other. And the state control the so-called commanding heights sectors. And in this diagram, it refers to, for example, telecom operators. Telecom operators is a sector where the state continues to dominate through the majority shareholders. Okay, and also if you think about media production and especially journalist production, it's very much state dominated. Okay, but at the same time, the state has very much liberalized and decentralized other less important sectors, including hardware manufacturing and to a different degree, the cyberspace. Okay, so if we use communication industry as an example, on this diagram, you will see that even the communication sector is not a monolithic whole. Actually, it is a hybrid economy. There are multiple political economies coexist, and they create all kind of frictions, but most of the time they coexist. Okay, so I would argue that Chinese market economy has been able to kind of develop by following multiple trajectories, and so from the state perspective, we can say that because the state oversees a hybrid economy, so therefore the state has an unusual capacity for self-maneuvering. Okay, especially when the global market is not doing well. Okay, so that's one dimension of kind of reality that I want to stress. The other dimension of the reality is the importance, the continuing importance of the party state. I think on the one hand, we study the economy, but at the same time, the party state continues to matter. Not only because of its state capacity, not only because of its political economy power, but also because of its political commitment. So I think it's still very important to understand the political philosophy and the political commitment of these party states. And in recent years, what we see is that because the post-Mao transformation has so much contradictory problems, so therefore struggles continues within the party state and beyond. So after the 2008 global economic crisis, I think non-Western experiences and memories and theories has been evoked in China, inside of China, within the leadership, to envision an alternative future. Okay. So what is interesting to me and to some of my colleagues is that the 20th century revolution didn't go away. It submerged, but then re-emerged. Okay. So recently, I see these the director who is in charge of African issues in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who made a statement saying that China is a developing country, and developing country is a identity not measured in economic terms, but it's a political identity. So I think it's very interesting to see that Chinese party state is renewing political commitment, kind of inherited from the 20th century revolution. So from there, we see policy paradigm shift and rhetorical transformations. In particular, since the 18th century Central Committee, 18th Party Congress, the most notable rhetorical shift is this more confident proclamation to build a socialist modern nation in all around the way. And the state also wants to build a so-called high-quality development. So by high-quality development, it definitely is not GDP-driven development. It's a development more kind of people-centric. So on the empirical side, we do see the rhetorical shift and the policy transformations as well. So, but at the same time, of course, in practice, I think the socialist claim to the future sometimes yields to the hegemony of present conditions, especially in recent years. The economic slowdown and the local banks' insolvency and people are not fully employed. All these problems put constraint on what the government can actually do. So on the one hand, we do see that socialism as a rhetoric comes back. On the other hand, in terms of the practice, I'm not very sure how far it has deviated from the old path. Okay, so that's the second dimension of what's going on. The third dimension, I think, has to do with the external environment. And we know that in recent years, the US-China has engaged in technological kind of delinking. Okay, and what is interesting is that this delinking is engineered by the US side. And so as a result, I think the Chinese leadership has been educated about the perils, follies, and the limits of capitalist integration. So I remember that before 2008, there was a talk about a dual ruling of the globe between US and China. But I think that idea appears to be really unrealistic. And so this deglobalization process actually is pushing Chinese leadership to recognize the limitations of a capitalist integration. So what has happened is that if we look at, and some political scientists actually has made predictions that delinking will actually encourage the smaller players, in this case China, to seek for the further self-sufficiency and to cut off interdependence with the dominant one, meaning the United States. I think such a prediction probably is correct if you look at the chip making industry. China is pursuing self-sufficiency in terms of chip design, chip production. But such a prediction is also partial because China still embraces globalization. But the question becomes, what kind of globalization? One can even claim that maybe it's time to think about globalization refashioned. Okay. So this is a list of foreign policies, foreign initiatives that China started on the digital domain. It's not very clear, but it's all the foreign policies related with the internet. And if you look at these lists, you will see a implicit counter-hegemonic agenda. Okay, so I think, so for China, I think on the one hand, it is embracing globalization, but on the other hand, a right question to ask is to what extent China can refashion globalization. So here is my puzzle. Apparently, views about the nature of Chinese society has been highly polarized, okay? And there is a clear dichotomy between Chinese official discourse and outside discourses. And the question becomes why? And and how to explain the implicit contrast between the conventional wisdoms that I outlined and what we experience inside of China, okay? And why? So these prompt me to reposition myself theoretically, especially with regard to the state. I use state theories, a variety of state theories. So in my previous work, I have talked about the capitalist logic of the state. I have attended the transnational orientations of the state, meaning that the state internationalize itself, internationalize its capacity in order to serve transnational business needs. And also I studied state-business relations, how state-business relations sometimes fused, sometimes at odds with each other. And now I think I need to add one more element, which is to appreciate socialist state formation beyond what we often say, what we often kind of label Chinese state as a pragmatic developmental state. So I think it's time to appreciate, put these dimension into the configuration in order to understand some of the Chinese state's behaviors. Otherwise, it's impossible to explain. So, so here are a list of theoretical frameworks that we can draw from. So for example, if you look at digital capitalism and China, basically these literature see China as part and parcel of global trends. So digital capitalism is a global and a universal trend, and China is part of it, okay? So again, China is just part and parcel of it. China probably follow certain trajectories, but ultimately China is becoming one variety of digital capitalism, okay? And the second one is neo-Gramscian approach, which really focus on how the state internationalized itself in response to the changing requirements of capitalism. And the geopolitical economy approach put attention on contestation and contention. So they study kind of geopolitical struggles, rivalries. So what I'm showing you is that there are a variety of theoretical frameworks available to study the nature of the state in a complex situation of political economy. But I want to add one more. I think there is a small group of literature which really talk about Chinese state as an actually existing socialist state. But it's not glorifying these socialist states. It put a lot of focus on the ongoing struggles, internal struggles within the party state and beyond. Okay. So that's kind of my new thinking. I'm kind of add one more layer to my pre-existing theoretical framework. So now I can get to the empirical part. So I think based on what I understand about the cyberspace, the cybersphere, and based on what I understand about the Chinese state, we can ask some new questions. One question is that given the cybersphere is not given that the cybersphere is not God-made, right? It's constituted by human actions, then we need to ask, what does it mean when we have a state-led digitization? How does the Chinese state try to kind of build up its own version of cybersphere? Okay, so I think that's an important question. The second one is that given that the Chinese state claims to build a socialist modern nation, to what extent China mitigate the internalized telos of capitalist modernity and advancing socialism at home? Okay, so I got these questions as my guiding questions. So, so the general summary of the research is that in China right now, every day there are many future-oriented projects going on. They are oftentimes digital projects, okay? And these digital projects are very good location to observe the interaction between the state and the political economy, okay? So what I find is that the party states and its guiding ideology is entangled and by extension contaminated by digital capitalism. So as a result, if we look close up at these digital projects, we will find that these digital projects basically unfold as interactive spaces between capitalist and non-capitalist forms. So I think it's too early to say Chinese digital future is a capitalist future because all these projects seems to stand between this line between capitalist and non-capitalist. So let me give you two case studies. The first one is Digital Village. As we know, live streaming is really big in China, okay? And the short video platforms nowadays has become the ground zero for public attention. So anyone from China will tell you how many hours they spend on kind of revealing the short videos from the short video platforms. So short video platforms actually has become a very important infrastructure, not only for urban population, but also for rural society. And so here it becomes an interesting dilemma. So for the local, for any locality, in order to gain any visibility, you have to put yourself on such platforms. Otherwise, your local identity will be easily kind of swallowed up by torrents of information flows. Okay, so from the locals' perspective, they want to ramp up localized culture and commodity production for trans-local marketing and distribution. So if you go to any county government, what they are doing is to, for example, encourage county-level media stations to produce short videos, to put on some social media platforms in order to gain local, trans-local popularity. Okay, so it becomes a developmental effort. If you want to develop as a place, you have to gain trans-local visibility. So from the locals' perspective, the idea is to drum up this capacity for producing content, to producing commodities that can be sold online. Okay, and from the platforms' perspective, from those social platforms' perspective, they actually also need local support because, as I mentioned, they are just the platforms. They are intermediary. They don't produce anything. So they need to constantly extend their lines of commodification. They need to commodify not only in labor, but also information, but also sentiment, as well as services and products. Okay, so therefore, platforms, social media platforms, oftentimes wants to tap into local support, and they want to build localized supply chains. Okay, so these mutual needs synthesized and creates a scenario where local government become a very important partner for social media platforms. So what I find in my fieldwork is that in many small towns, local government help the social media platforms to localize themselves, and so some gateways, some institutions are being created. Okay, so one institution is a live streaming school, and on the left-hand side, this live streaming school is based in in a remote area in Zhejiang province. And it is not a coastal part of Zhejiang, it's an interior part of Zhejiang. In this region, there is not much industrial asset, there is not much international trade, so the development is relatively backward. Okay, and what happened is that during the pandemic, the peasants in that region face really bleak business situation. They cannot sell their foods, so the government, local government, stepped up and collaborated with Alibaba to set up these live streaming school to train peasants to talk in front of the camera. Okay, so the idea is to turn peasants into communicative labor. Okay, to sell the produce. So that's and a material building is being set up. So it's not just about communication. It's not just about interaction, but also some material establishment was being set up. So this building is a testimony to this state effort. And what is interesting, what I find interesting is that this building actually extends the state's functionalities. It extends the state space. Okay, the state not only set up these schools, but also set up a trade union for these live streamers. So the state is expanding itself by helping the platforms. Okay, and then later on, the government not only set up these schools for training, but also set up an industry. It localized a pet caring industry. So it enabled some factories to manufacture locally, and therefore its live streamers can sell it, can market it across the web. Okay, so this is one example where the state kind of worked with the platform to extend the platform by setting up a training program, by setting up a school actually. And the second example is a digital park, also located in a remote area, in a mountainous area. And this area, again, economically is not very advanced. Actually, it's quite isolated mountainous areas. So what the local government was doing is to set up these economic park, economic zone, to host internet celebrities for doing e-commerce. Okay, and the idea is that if the park can group a good number of internet celebrities, the local people can better sell local specialty goods. Okay, so this industrial park itself is interesting because the land was owned by the local government, but the operation, the daily management is run by a private entrepreneur. So the private entrepreneur actually have dual identity. On the one hand, he is a private entrepreneur, but on the other hand, he is also affiliated with a party. So he helps the party state to extend its functionalities into economic management. So again, this industrial park is about respatialized live broadcasting activities. So the idea is to upgrade the marketing influence and also to upgrade the supply chain. So the third case actually is another one about is an e-commerce enterprise. So the e-commerce enterprise is really fascinating because it's a e-commerce company that tries to help peasants to sell their goods, and the peasants oftentimes they don't know how to upload image, and they don't have commercial standards to judge whether these produce is good enough for supermarket sales. Okay, so this e-commerce company basically did a lot of cultural work and legwork to educate local villagers how to do e-commerce online. Okay, so I think I'm a little behind my my schedule. I think we have. So okay, so that's some cases about the digital village, and then another one I will be brief about this is the city brain. I'm from Hangzhou, and anyone who visited Hangzhou knows that it's a city that hosts Alibaba. It's a headquarters city for Alibaba. Okay, so Hangzhou is also well known for its digital governance program, and the most well-known artifacts for digital city, smart city, is this technical architecture called a city brain. So if you look at the right-hand side, it's a technical map of the city brain. It looks really abstract. Okay, so the basic idea is that the computer will take data from different departments of the government, and also take real-time data gathered from, for example, traffic lights, or from sensors that scattered around the city, in order for the government to make better decisions. So this city brain has been applied in a variety of areas, including traffic management, including healthcare, and also tourist management, etc. So where does the city brain actually is located? Actually, it is located in this park. So again, it's a collaboration between the government and the business. Okay, the government provides the land, and it created a business ecosystem. So Alibaba is the dragon head company, and Alibaba provides the computational capacity, and then a whole range of small local companies come to support, becoming part of this ecosystem. So what is interesting is that by offering the land, the Hangzhou municipal government is able to creating a new ecosystem, business ecosystem from scratch, and most of the procurement, most of the business orders go to these local companies. So the government basically create a supply chain from the local companies. And so these diagrams basically show how the city brain operates as a social system rather than as a technical system. So the city brain basically is an architecture. Okay. So on the left-hand side, the local government offer data. On the right-hand side, the tech companies offer computational capacities. And also, Alibaba is responsible for creating a business ecosystem. And what is interesting is that the city brain is actually not managed by Alibaba. The state kept Alibaba away from managing the city brain. The state created a joint venture, a state-controlled joint venture to operate the city brain, basically to protect the data, to protect the interest of the government in the name of the interest of the public. And the third component, I think, is really worth mentioning is the participation of traditional media. Why? Because the city brain is about governing the society from distance, right? So I can know where the pandemic is happening by collecting data on everyone's health conditions. That's how the city brain functions. But this kind of centralized control oftentimes will have a lot of bugs. So it creates a chaotic situation where there are so much complaints during the pandemic. So people make phone calls, and they often make phone calls to traditional localized newspaper. So as a result, this whole system becomes more kind of inclusive in the sense that traditional media become part of these social technical system rather than being excluded from it. Okay. So with these two case studies, now let me draw some conceptual conclusion. So I think, first of all, it's important to transcend the networked and hierarchical binaries when we think about the developmental politics of the internet. Okay. Oftentimes we think about internet because it's connecting people. So if there's any politics with the internet, it is a matter of exclusion, disconnecting. But I think there is also a hierarchical dimension of the internet politics. Okay, and then again, the cybersphere, as we conceptualize it, is a combination of materiality and communication. As cybersphere expands, it is enriched by capital-intensive new technologies, and is structured by digital platforms that form relational archipelagos with one another. Just as important, I think it's crucial to emphasize that the cybersphere cannot survive without thrusting roots into specialized and often territorialized domains. And so therefore, local governments and the social actors often become indispensable partners in reconstituting the cybersphere from outside. And new gateways from the live streaming schools to the city brain, originally external to the cybersphere, are set up to channel labor information into the web-based circulation. So the state and all kinds of social actors actually are part of the reconstruction work of the cybersphere. So this brings to the second point about the Chinese state. I think we need to see Chinese state as a communicative actor. It's not just about it's not just an economic actor, but also it's not only a political actor, but also a communicative actor, because the Chinese state participated and played a primary role in reconstituting the cybersphere from the outside. And oftentimes the Chinese state is able to prioritize local perspectives. So on the one hand, the state has to make sure that the politics of scales and the visibility continues because the government needs the support of the platforms. But on the other hand, the state apparently is prioritize local needs of the local community. So I want to end this talk with this quote from our recent special issue. I think it's when we study China as an ongoing phenomenon, it's imperative to resist the temptations of reductionism and linearity on the one hand, and the trapping of geopolitical rhetoric on the other hand. Living histories, functioning institutions, and acting subjectivities constitute the context within which China acts, communicates, and interacts. So with that, I will end my talk, and I will really hope to have more interaction and with the audience. Thank you.
Can you hear me all right? Okay. Right. Want first of all to say that's one of the most exciting talks I've heard for a long time, and there are a huge number of questions and thoughts which it should be raising with you about how we think about China, how we think about relations between America and China, Germany and China, and so on. I'll come to that in a minute. I want to say also that Yuhong has a very, very sophisticated view about the role of the internet and in general of what she calls very nicely the cybersphere, indicating that we shouldn't think of the digital world as as something given out there which is just determined by people writing programs. We should think of the digital world as being wholly integrated into the way in which we live, and the influence is going both ways around. I think what I find most exciting about what you were were saying is how the various ways in which you can use the internet and digital space to move into all sorts of different areas of the Chinese economy, but above all, to move into smaller towns and cities and so on. So I was thinking about a lot of the things in the lecture as about leveling up. So we have the debate here about leveling up, and as you know, we have an amazingly competent, brilliant conservative government with many ideas about how to solve the problems of leveling up, and a lot of them are giving £5 million to a town to build one or two more big supermarkets in the centre. The approach which you're talking about is at a really superior and interesting level, and I think it's something which we should really think about a lot about what you've been saying. Now the second thing then comes on to what should the relations be? I sort of feel something like, you know, these are really stupid kids in the playground. The United States on one hand and China on the other hand, just sort of behaving in a stupid way in relation to each other. So you could ask the question, what would happen if the American government says, look, okay, it's been a little bit stupid of us to have this protectionist policy and to try and clamp up on the free flow of information between America and China. Why don't we go to a world where Chinese students can come and study again in the United States to get PhDs and so on in the sciences and bring those back to China? Why can't we let Chinese companies have access, if they buy it, to developments which are going on in the West? And in exchange for that, we want you to stop talking about Taiwan, because that's just an explosive issue and a very dangerous issue to play around with. And then we would say to the Chinese, listen, you're really open to do what you want as far as technology is concerned. Talk about de-risking and delinking is stupid. You just try and establish normal relations. Now, if you think through what the problems of that are, I mean, there are obvious problems in how you actually make sure that both sides go along with that. But I really work on the auto industry, and a lot of that is to do with relations between the big German companies and Chinese industry. And China has got two really effective privately owned Chinese companies. One is BYD and the other is Geely. And they've both been very successful. They haven't gone up to a German type of level, but they've been very successful at what they do. There are many things which there are many aspects of technology which they could well import from the West, from German companies if they were allowed to do that. German companies, who on the whole produce the sort of top level of luxury cars, they have a huge desire to be able to sell properly and without any constraints in China. And that would then solve a whole range of different problems. Now, in addition to all that, we've got into a crazy situation about macroeconomics and slow growth both in China and to a lesser extent in the United States. And I think a lot of macroeconomists would say that there are actually relatively straightforward answers to this, one of which would be to develop a really effective system of social welfare in China and make sure that people have got adequate pensions, because if they have had adequate pensions, Chinese families, particularly in the peasant families, wouldn't feel the need to save massive amounts of money in order to meet their pensions. They would then spend more money on consumer goods and so on. This is really simply to say, really, if I may say so, stimulated by your really marvelous lecture. Here are two huge countries, and we can add in Germany as a third one, with incredible capacities. And what we've always learned in economics is free trade makes a great deal of sense. So if the Chinese can't export things to the United States because there are certainly a whole lot of things which sophisticated things Chinese can produce relatively cheaply, that's really saying to Americans, why are you looking a gift horse in the mouth? If the Chinese are prepared to sell things to you cheaply, why do you stop Americans from buying them? That should make absolute common sense. Anyhow, we've got into this really unfortunate situation at the moment, and I hope that this talk will have made people think through what are the things you can do, and this notion of integrating across towns and cities what the role of the state in the form of city governments, county governments, and in bigger places municipal governments, combining what they do with the private sector makes, it seems to me, a great deal of sense. So I thought that was very fascinating. Anyway, terrific.
So thank you both very much. I also agree that was a really wonderful and interesting presentation, both about the nature of the Chinese state, but also about the nature of digitization. So I'm very excited about what kinds of questions we're going to get from the audience. I think we have a microphone upstairs and downstairs today, so feel free to raise your hand wherever you are. I'm going to have a look behind the screen. Do we have any brave people? We have a brave person at the back. I can't. Is it Joel? It's Joel. Yeah.
Hi. Hi. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I've got two questions, if I may. So, first question. So, how has President Xi's crackdown on the tech sector in China affected these digitalization efforts, especially in the recent years? And my second question is about this whole idea of, using the cybersphere to build an inclusive society and to inform policy decisions, like with the city brain. So, have there been any concerns, especially from the public, about personal privacy and data protection? And how does the Chinese government go about addressing such concerns? Thank you.
Okay, I see another question in the back row. It's very dark in here today, so it's kind of hard to see. Did you have your hand up? No, okay. Oh, there is a question right here in the middle. So we'll take a couple of questions, if that's okay. So the lady in the sort of nice white shirt, pale gray shirt.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I was wondering, you mentioned about the different industrialization process that they're in Zhejiang specifically, like the city brain and the e-commerce platforms, etc. It all looks very much inward industrialization. How could China utilize these technologies to a more outward-looking industrialization and play a bigger role in the global forces that you mentioned?
Okay, two great questions. So Yuhong, would you like to answer them? And David, if you have comments too, you're very welcome.
Okay, so for the first question, how the President Xi is popping up the tech industry, is that the first question? Okay, I think the government definitely is making good use of industrial policies. And it's not something new. I think the industrial policy has been going on for many years, especially since 2006, I remember. Because at the beginning of China's reform, China outsourced its weakness to external vendors. Okay, China is not very good at, for example, chip making. So China buy chips from outside. So therefore, China built up these systematic dependence on companies like Qualcomm, Cisco, etc. But after 2006, if my memory serves me correct, I think there is an emphasis on indigenous innovation. Kind of research institute and university labs are being set up to do more kind of ground zero type of research. So I think the worsening external environment basically accelerating the efforts. That's for sure. So I would agree with people who are in political science who made the prediction that the delinking imposed by the United States will push the smaller player, in this case China, to seek more self-sufficiency, especially in those extremely vulnerable areas. But at the same time, I don't think that China is closing up its doors. It's embracing globalization. So therefore, we see barren roads. We see China is trying to re-spatialize globalization. So it's not just about opening up towards, for example, Western capital, but also tries to seek collaboration with the global South. So I think it's not about closing up, self-sufficiency in the sense of closing up. It's a matter of kind of building up, fixing the weakness, the vulnerability, and at the same time, kind of reconfiguring China's opening up dimensions. So find more partners, external partners, rather than just relying upon one or two countries. So I think that's something pretty clear. But other than that, I think you have to be more microscopic to follow what exactly is going on. Yeah. So the second question is about
privacy, I think, and sort of collection of data and whether.
Oh, the privacy. Okay. The privacy is a sensitive topic. I mean, it's a sensitive issue. I think the city brain bothers people. Like during the pandemic, I think there's on the one hand, like we know in China, we use a mobile phone to record our health, right? So if you are healthy, your mobile phone will show green color. And then if you caught the disease, your phone will give you a red color. Okay, so that's how these kind of remote control is putting people into different categories. And so the governance is not about governing the real people. It's about governing in really abstract terms. People are turned into statistics, I think, okay, and into categories. So you are being put into different categories. And if you are accidentally put in a category of risk, then you will be, for example, put in quarantine. So during that process, that experiment, kind of large-scale kind of public health experiment, I think not only the government but also the public realized that technological solutions always have limits, okay? And because some stupid mistakes are being made. For example, I just walk a few steps away from my home, then the tracking system will identify me like leaving the city. So because there are so many mistakes being made, so accidentally we find that traditional media, which has been announced as dead, kind of renewed their lifespan. Like traditional media, local newspaper, which relied upon advertising revenue, but the advertising revenue in recent years plunged, just like in the West. And what I find is that all these community newspapers actually find a new obligation. They find a very strong tie with local community because they are the ones who got the phone calls when things goes wrong. So the city brain is a technological solution for social governance. But what is interesting that I want to demonstrate is that ultimately local newspaper become part of these technological solution. So instead of new technology replacing old technology, old media, actually these two types of media coexist because they have different capacities to connect with society. Okay, so I think going back to your question about privacy, by and large, I think Chinese people are less sensitive about privacy because of the collective way of living. So, but at the same time, the middle class in China definitely are aware of that concept, and there's tons of complaints. So for the city brain to keep functioning, I think both the company and the government needs to put its power into the cage. So it's not about kind of always unleashing the technological freedom, but also put the technological freedom under certain kind of legal constraint. So I think privacy is not a everyday vocabulary in Chinese context. Just like rice, I was talking to my colleagues at LSE, like he was talking about rice. But I think in China, we don't talk about rice that often. We talk about responsibilities a lot. So when it comes to privacy, I think people don't talk about this that much. But I think the awareness is rising for sure. Yeah, because of the, ironically, because of the introduction of architectures like the city brain.
So there was also a final question that was about the kind of, your talk was a lot about inward industrialization. And it was a question about the kind of outward relationships.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I actually know very little. I know that Alibaba has been expanding globally, for example, into the Middle East. And also there are business deals in Europe, European countries. And in Southeast Asia, I think Alibaba and Tencent also have huge market shares. And I think, I don't know, like I think they probably do localization and they probably work with local partners. But I'm not sure. I think oftentimes a project like a City Brain is a state project, even in countries like Indonesia. So I think it's a matter of who are in the driver's seat. Yeah, so I don't think I have sufficient information to answer that question, but I think that's very interesting to keep following about like the digital footprint overseas.
So David, did you want to add anything, or should I take more?
No. Go on to more questions.
I have a lot of questions, so I'm kind of hoping that there aren't that many questions, but I also hope that there are. Okay, so I see one question here, and then Max at the back. Anybody upstairs? Okay, go for it.
Hi, Yuang. Thanks for that. Hello, David. My question was about, you touched briefly on this idea that you think that the digital space, or the cybersphere, is not, the jury's still out on whether it's kind of managed in a socialist or in a capitalist way, and that you wouldn't like to fall one way or another, that maybe this is something, a judgment that we can make in a decade's time or 2 decades' time. But it seemed a little bit from the case studies that, particularly the ones where rural vendors and peasants and were being kind of taught and instructed in kind of digital infrastructure, that these were ways of integrating them into a kind of a broader capitalist system, right? In a way that this kind of digital infrastructure is allowing for in new and novel ways. And true, the state is kind of playing an interesting role, maybe in these JVs that you mentioned, or through state capital by giving land and other things. But it strikes me as a bit on the state capitalist side, not so much. I don't really see immediately where the socialism comes in. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that. I understand that it's been kind of it's been important in the discourse the last 5 or 7 years, this return to socialism. But where do you see it in this kind of digital space?
Okay, and the question at the back from Max, who's the gentleman with the long curly blonde hair.
Hello, thank you for the interesting lecture. I had kind of a related question in a way, I think. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit about the relationship between the Chinese government and some of those big tech companies like Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, that sort of thing. So about that relationship, and then what the effects of that relationship are. Thank you.
Okay, great. Actually, I'm going to take one more question from James in the front here. And again, if you have a question, you can put your hand up, and I'm looking out for you guys.
I mean, thank you both. It's really interesting. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was in China and had a visit to Yiwu, this place where, claims to produce 70% of the world's socks, for instance, the biggest commodity markets that you could find anywhere. And we had a talk with the city government about the whole development of business in small commodity trade. And what I found very interesting was that they were really pushing and encouraging e-commerce, but they necessitated those who establish an e-commerce business to have a physical location in the city. They were promoting e-commerce in a way that did not put a heavy tax burden on these startups and these commodity producers, but their thinking was that by having a physical location, they could be taxed in the future. So this is a kind of state, I think a very responsible kind of approach to e-commerce by the state that could be learned even here, could be learned from. But I'm just wondering, how generalized is this? Was this just something very specific in Yiwu, or is this part of the thinking of this spatializing?
Okay, we'll take those questions.
Okay. I think the first question is a really good question. So I want to say that, given my observation, I don't think that Chinese state wants to develop the cybersphere without the support of capital. I think the Chinese way of developing digitization and modernization relies on capital. So, so does that mean utilizing capital? Does that mean is capitalism? So I think that's, for me, is there is a there is a bridge that needs to be made. So I think people are aware that when capital predominates, all kind of capitalistic symptoms will emerge, including labor exploitation. Like if you go to any digital kind of so-called digital swap shops, the people work long hours and they are being exploited, right? So all these symptoms are observable in China, including labor problems, including the business kind of endless pursuit of profits. But at the same time, I think it's very important to go back to the diagram that I draw, like the hybrid landscape, the hybrid system, where different type of political economies coexist. So I think what I observe is that on the micro level, on the micro policy level, the state is, on the one hand, co-opting these giant companies, but on the other hand, punish these companies by kind of forcing them to disassemble, like they don't want to grow too big, including Alibaba. And so there's efforts on the regulatory level to regulate these giant players. And then on the more kind of institutional level, I think these companies, in order to survive and thrive in China, they somehow have to take up political responsibilities. So they do kind of political tasks for the government, including developmental projects. So I think somehow some kind of trade-off are being made. On the one hand, these companies remains to follow the financial kind of signals, right? They need to keep their balance sheets looks really nice, etc. And these companies are stock market listed. And on the other hand, they also fulfill certain political obligations, including the poverty alleviation obligations. So I think that's So I think you're right. If we look, if we kind of interpret the empirical evidence that I show, one can also argue that it seems that the local governments are doing the servitude for the tech companies, because the local government actually is making it more convenient for these tech companies to extract value from the local community. But then I'm thinking, what are the options? What are the alternatives? So I think, given the fact that China is already part of these web of interconnectivities, in order for any developmental project to have any viability, it seems necessary to participate in the platform economy. Only if you kind of back away from the platform economy. So I think be part of the platform economy seems to be a necessity for a locality, okay? And then otherwise you are isolated, because the information flow determines people's attention, determines where they spend the money. So I'm debated, for sure. But I do see that as a whole, there is a very genuine effort to kind of uplifting kind of backward regions. And a lot of these efforts are not capitalist driven. They are not for the sake of enlarging the capital. Okay, yeah. And then
So then there was a question about state-business relations between the Chinese state and tech companies, which I guess is kind of similar to
I think I answered that question. And the third question, James' question, I agree that maybe there is a state logic of taxing to keep the e-commerce at a place where the physical markets are. And there is also a platform logic, because platforms are like, they are like colonizers. They have to colonize on a place where there are a lot of resources. So I visited a remote village where the tea trade actually is Asian trade. And what is interesting is that live streamers, they set up their live e-commerce on that traditional market because they can get immediate access to the production, okay? So I don't think the platform can exist alone. Like if we don't cooperate, the Facebook has to go bankrupt tomorrow. Like if we all kind of cancel Facebook, the Facebook has to close. So I think the platform on the one hand are very powerful. It's a very powerful redistributing mechanism, but at the same time, it cannot live without the cooperation of the traditional community and the population. So I think, I think there's a general pattern,
Super, super interesting. Do we have more questions from students? Or you guys are going to let me ask some questions? Okay, well, I have a few questions that I would like to ask. The first question is kind of related to the city brain. And, Joel asked the question about people's privacy, and from your answer, I got a sense that the government might be aware with problems with this kind of mode of governance. And that got me thinking about the patchy nature of the internet, the fact that these kinds of networks might not pick up everybody's data. There might be kind of missing populations, there might be mistakes in this system. And in the UK recently we've had this post office scandal, where a technical system, there were all sorts of problems, and there was absolutely no transparency and acknowledgement of these kinds of mistakes in the system. So I wondered, first of all, if you could tell us how reflective is the Chinese state of the kind of patchiness of the data that they might be collecting, and how proactive and thoughtful are they about thinking about the incompleteness of the data? Because this is a state, this isn't a private company. You'd think a state would be interested in capturing the full picture of Chinese society. My second question is related to the other case study, and I've been struggling to remember the name of the researcher, but we had a digital gender workshop last year, and there was somebody who was presenting a similar case in China of these training sessions for people, I don't know what you call them, live streaming people.
Live streamers.
And from that discussion, it seemed to be like a very big gap between the expectations people have and the reality of being successful. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the challenge of the expectation-reality gap. Whether the Chinese state is worried about kind of projecting these very hyped up visions of what the internet can offer people versus the kind of reality of how difficult it is for people to make it in that kind of world. Are there any other questions?
He says that researcher was you, Hong.
Was it you? Was it?
Well, I was at your workshop.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. How embarrassing. Okay, so my third question, you were talking about China. At various points, you referred to it as a smaller player in relation to the US. But for people who work on development and are interested in other developing countries, China doesn't look like a smaller player. China looks like a very big player with a kind of history of state formation that's very different from other parts of the world, and an immense kind of state capacity. And I'm wondering what people who are interested in other countries and interested in digital development should draw from this case study. What are the things that you think the Chinese experience indicates more broadly about digital development in other kinds of contexts? You know, what are the lessons there? Okay.
Okay, thanks for all these very thoughtful questions. So first of all, with regard to patchy data, I think I just talked about how the city brain oftentimes mistake with data, right? So the tracking, the storing, they could at every step of data processing, there could be mistakes, and and sometimes the problem, the crisis will explode when the data is too comprehensive, it's too anticipatory. So if you got historical data and you combine historical data with real-time data, and then the government start to make predictions, that's the time when the public got nervous, right? Because it can potentially punish certain groups of people. So I remember that a couple of years ago, Beijing municipal government, I think there is a rumor going on saying that Beijing municipal government wants to set up facial recognition sensors in every subway station. So that got really got the people anxious. And then a leading state media, Guangming Daily, published a kind of a commentary criticizing these kind of potential practice. So I think, yeah, the patchy data is one kind of problem, and then kind of a surveillance type of governing is also people are concerned about. Yeah, so I don't know if I answer your question directly, but I do see that even though the Chinese society is not as outspoken as Western societies, there are growing disagreements over how the digital should be used and for what purpose.
But do you think that the state and civil servants are reflective of the patchiness?
The patchiness means that...
Of the data, the incomplete, the missing... I don't know if you can answer.
Okay, I don't know.
Imperfect quality.
Imperfect quality.
Yeah.
Okay. That's not. I'm not aware of the.
Okay.
Yeah. Because the data collection is always very arbitrary, right? Mm-hmm. You select the data according to certain criteria. There is also always a mental kind of outline pre-existing, and then therefore you go outside. You go to collect data. So it's so the patchiness I think is determined by how you conceptualize the purpose of the data. Yeah, so that's how I see it. And the second question, the gap, I think is very interesting. So going back to the example of the live streaming school, there is actually a twist in that story. The live streaming school was set up to help peasants to sell locally produced fruits. And so it really started with a very, very altruistic purpose. But then later on, they find out that it doesn't make economical sense to sell fruits online. Okay, because the fruits, some fruits could be larger than others. There's no, only if it is planted by agriculture industry, the fruits are always kind of vary in terms of size, in terms of the flavor. So it ends up that the live streaming school has becoming a school meant for rather than amateur live streamers, but more kind of professional live streamers. Mm-hmm. So I think in China, so what has happened is that they want to build this momentum in this remote area for live streaming. And once there are several established internet celebrities, they hope that these internet celebrities can make a living on their own, and on their kind of when they have time, when they have extra energy, they can help the peasants to sell produce. Mm-hmm. So I think I think the government now indeed is becoming pragmatic in the sense that they first of all they want to participate in the platform economy by having a local team of professional live streamers, and at the same time they want these live streamers to do extra work to help the peasants. So and of course being a live streamer is a tough job. It's not that easy. So that's why, for example, the economic park, they provide a lot of support. The support of providing supply chains. So the live streamers are not selling things that they like personally. They sell things that are recommended to them by some brand name companies. So so I think it's tough, but so I think it's so for the local government's perspective, the idea is that I want to upgrade the visibility of these location in the mediated space, because otherwise I'm just a remote place, invisible to most of the public. Okay, the last question.
Was the question about what can we draw from China's experience, other developing countries that are very, China is quite unique.
Yeah, China is very unique. Yeah, that's a very good question. I don't, I think, how to generalize? I don't think I have the answer for that. I think a couple of years ago when I was writing my my second book, I was being asked the same question, like how does this Chinese experience generalizable to the rest of the developing countries? And at that time I said the state matters. Like when, for example, for critical scholars, oftentimes they criticize, they support civil society, but they already give up on the state. So at least from my experience in the United States, I think critical political economists, the radical scholars, they consider themselves as radical, so they distance themselves from the political center. Yeah. And as a result, the state capacity is being given away to the conservatives. So I think the state matters. So you have to not only criticize but also have the weaponry, which is to some extent is the state.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to have a socialist state.
Yeah.
Yeah. Even though maybe the state could deviate from its own political commitment, but it's still very important to have a.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I took from your cases is that the kind of imagined capabilities of digital technologies as networking devices, those capabilities aren't realized through technology alone, right? That the state is playing the supporting role at every turn. And I think that's similar to the state matters. Okay, so we have about 15 more minutes or so for extra questions. Do we have anybody with burning questions? We have one question down here and one question up there and one question here and 10. Okay, so I guess I ask everybody to make their questions quite concise so we can fit all four.
Actually, it's not going to be a question, more like a short comments.
Could you talk a little bit more?
Actually, it's not going to be a question. It's more like a short comments on the previous question on this data patching issue, and also what's the implication of Chinese experience. I can probably draw a little bit on what China did on this this poverty reduction. How
if you could talk with
how they actually use this the data to pinpoint the households of this kind of the poor households which I think needs this assistance. So the strategy they use is actually they just go to each of this households of this poor village to find out what they have, and actually to identify them whether they are meet to the criteria to receive the subsidy or assistance. But obviously there are lots of misinformation. If you just ask people about what things you have, so they actually come up with this different strategies. For example, they could ask their neighbors. So okay, do you know who is the poorest household in your whole village? So using those kind of techniques or strategies to try to improve the quality of the data. So this is not necessarily only come from those digital techniques, but they do rely on those these digital techniques to help them to improve the data quality. So I think this is maybe related to the question raised about how they actually dealing with this data patching or data imperfection question. But this actually also, another one is actually on this implication. I think it's again, using the same examples, I think it's about how you can target in this a poor family, which is very unique Chinese approach. But I heard actually from one of my colleagues who are actually doing this, sharing this experience to other Central Asia countries. Uzbekistan, for example, I think they are also approaching to try to using this how to identify the household, the poor households, then just providing this necessary support. So those are some anecdotal examples I'm just going to want to share. So probably going to just related to this questions.
Okay, thank you very much. So let's have the question upstairs, and then Tin in the front here, Matt. Matt? At the very front, Tin. And then Vladimir.
Thank you. I would like to ask a question in Mandarin first, then translated into English.
Okay.
洪博士你好，想请问您，就是中国在发展智慧城市和数字村庄项目方面的举措，对中国社会经济差异的影响，可以理解为贫富差距。然后第二个问题的话，刚才主持人已经问了，就是如何在全球南方的其他发展中国家实施类似的技术驱动发展战略，有没有哪些可以借鉴的方式 ？So my question is, how have China's initiatives in developing smart cities and digital village projects impacted socio-economic disparities within the country? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And Tin in the front.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for this wonderful talk. I think my question goes back a bit to that image you showed with the Economist front page and the Chinese internet in a cage. We still very much find in the literature this conception of the Chinese internet as being Chinese. And I feel that in your conception of the cybersphere, this Chinese cybersphere seems to be very much Chinese, but I'm wondering to what extent, when you look at the mix of hardware and software that very much come from different suppliers still in China, even though there's this effort to, produce more indigenous technologies. I'm just wondering to what extent the Chinese cybersphere is actually Chinese until now, the implications, if you could say a bit more on how it relates to global forces and how Chinese tech firms are still very much embedded in the global economy, and there are big influences in the way they operate in China. And my second question has more to do with the theoretical framework. I very much like the fact that you're using this kind of infrastructural turn and looking at the materiality of the technology. I myself try to use this a bit in my own PhD. I was just wondering if you could reflect a bit on the advantages and limits of the theoretical framework and what you found in your own research. Thank you.
Okay, we have a final question from Vladimir, who's in a very nice suit today.
Thank you. My question also relates to the Economist front page. The idea of a China's cage cannot be applied to the way Western cybersphere works today, because we see a lot of censorship. We see the idea that misinformation is the biggest threat expressed at Davos World Economic Forum. We see Biden's unconstitutional bullying of Facebook and other social media into censoring some information. So probably instead of having China's cage at the front page, we should have I know, the United States cage or European cage, but probably we will not see that. So to what extent the role of the state in censoring, controlling the cybersphere extends to the West?
Okay, you have about 5 minutes.
Okay, so I think the first question, I think I already answered that about the developmental gap, right? So how does developmental gap affect? Well, China, of course, is a big country. We can talk about many Chinas, right? Depends on where you are located. So Zhejiang, of course, is very is a front runner in terms of digitization. But if you go to other places, maybe the local government doesn't have as much bargaining power as Zhejiang local government has with regard to Alibaba platform. So that's my hypothesis. I'm not 100% sure about how to think about kind of variations within China. But I'm sure if you go to Henan or like Hebei, like probably the situation, the government business relationship will be different, and the public's awareness is different. Yeah. So that's kind of my my answer. The second question is about materiality, how the framework. Well, because I'm from communication, so I think materiality is important to justify my approach. Most of the people in journalism and communication studies, they study textual representation. So they study culture. They study culture representation. And they, at American training, like the mainstream American communications research focus on median communication effect. So how can I package a story to persuade people? That's the dominant concern. Yeah, so I think having the material turn of communication research is really important for me. And in terms of the limitations of this framework, well, I think right now I'm struggling how to internationalize my research because I have focused a lot on China internally, explaining China, making sense of China. But how to follow the digital footprints. And yeah, so I think how, for example, how Chinese political economy participated in the digital formation in Africa, in Latin America. That's I think that your workshop will will be a very good launch pad for a new type of research. Yeah, okay, so the last
question was like, is the US also in a cage? I don't know if I'm paraphrasing.
Yeah, I think one of my colleagues did a very interesting empirical work. She's studied people's behaviors. Like her question is, if without the Great Firewall, will Chinese people visit a website outside of China? So he find out that even without the firewall, people will still visit the Chinese language website because of the linguistic limitation. So I think something is going on in the United States. I think when people use the internet, it has a lot to do with their linguistic capacity, their social kind of orientation. Like if you have a ancestor coming from the Central Europe, I think it's more likely to visit, to pay attention to information from that part of the world. So I don't think that the internet opens up a window to everything. I think still your cognitive framework influence how you use the internet.
Yeah. There was recently a piece in the New York Times about how the top 10 Chinese films in the last few years no longer features American movies. That they're dropping out of the kind of market. So let's just thank Professor Yu Hong and David Soskice for this very stimulating talk. I also want to draw your attention that the Cutting Edge Lecture Series does not finish today. We have a great talk next week on debt and the climate change precipice. How can the global majority cope?